This next one comes from, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation here, Sakina Mayu. This comes from her blog, entitled, What Square Enix Did Wrong in Their Multimedia Approach for Final Fantasy XV. Let's just address the elephant in the room here. Final Fantasy XV's storyline is a hot mess. Even Tabata admitted in his interview that the storyline in Final Fantasy XV is messy. Some people will say there's nothing wrong with the story, but for the rest of us, myself included, there are tons of things that are left unexplained in the game, making most of us feel unsatisfied with how the story has been laid out in the game. The only way to fill in the plot loopholes is to watch Kingsglaive, Brotherhood, and read Final Fantasy XV Prologue Parting Ways, and yes, buying and playing the DLC. If you can only buy just one DLC, then buy Episode Ignis. The reason for that isn't because I'm an Ignis fangirl, it's because the DLC does fill in some of the plot loopholes in the game. If you can read Japanese, buying a book like Final Fantasy XV Official Works will help as well. The book offers an explanation for the alternate ending in Episode Ignis, so if you feel like you need clarification of arguing back and forth with someone on Reddit, then get that book. That seems like a lot to do just to get a better understanding of the story, right? I can't really say for sure why they decided to have a multimedia approach for Final Fantasy XV, but the reason could be because of the open world concept. I'm pretty sure that they wanted both the open world gameplay and an engaging storyline to be included in the game, but with only a limited number of time to work on the game, then something has to give away. You can guess with which one they had to sacrifice. As a result, now we have a game with the open world gameplay and a bare minimum storyline. I'm sure that they realised what they did would cause a major problem in storytelling as a result of the decision. So, they compensate that by using other forms of media to fill in the plot loopholes, release update patches at a later date, and additional stories in the form of DLC. As expected, they did update the game at a later date, with a few extra scenes and gameplay. They also released Episode Gladio, Episode Prompto, and Episode Ignis DLC to fill in the blank some parts of the story. Even with the latest updates and also the DLC, we still need to depend on other forms of media to fill in the missing part of the story. Whether you like it or not, Square Enix wants us to engage with Final Fantasy XV in a different format if we want to get the whole picture. Even if that's their intention, they're still doing it the wrong way. Here's why I think their multimedia approach for Final Fantasy XV is just a plain disaster. People's first contact with the series plays a major role when it comes to finding a new audience. That's the reason why many manga and light novel publishers are pushing hard to get manga and light novels adapted into anime. The reason for that is simple. Some people's first contact with a franchise is through anime. What's even better, their discovery of the series tends to translate into manga and light novel sales after the anime ended. It's because of this reason that gets many game developers to push for anime adaptation of their game as well. The video game fanbase is already big on its own thanks to the game localization in multiple languages. But for game developers, it doesn't hurt to use the same strategy to attract many people to buy the game. After all, some anime fans are also video game fans as well. Anime adaptation does help to convert exposure to sales. In other words, game developers are using a different form of media to attract people to a different form of media. We see this all the time in Hollywood, where book sales increase right after a movie adaptation comes out. But for Square Enix, they don't use a multimedia approach just to attract a new audience. They're also using a multimedia approach to get people invested in the storyline. Does their approach work? Well, the release of Kingsglaive, Brotherhood, and Final Fantasy XV Prologue Parting Ways does help to get people interested in the game, and it's possible that it also helps with attracting a new audience to the game. But those things fall flat on this simply because most people don't want to invest their time in consuming different media. They expect the game to have a complete storyline without having to consume other forms of media just to understand the storyline. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind with the multimedia approach, but the multimedia approach should only be used as a way to attract a new audience. It's never meant to be used as filler to a broken storyline. Doing that will only create even more disconnections within the story of the game. Instead of having the story scattered everywhere, they should have everything covered in the main game. From there, they can choose to expand the story in a different medium. Please don't do this again. I hope that Square Enix already learns the lesson by now, that they should never attempt to have the story scattered in different media. To be honest, I don't mind about the open world concept and a switch to action-based command from the time-based command. All I ever want is a complete game. Feeling satisfied, I already tie all the loose ends. It's sad that Final Fantasy 15 doesn't give me that feeling at all. I have to depend on other sources, and the wiki or page, just to understand the storyline. Some part of me feels like Square Enix should just let this game die and move on with something else. But part of me feels like they should be cleaning up the mess before they do anything else. I'm glad they were willing to go on with what most fans want, which is to patch the story. Now I can only hope the same thing won't happen again for Final Fantasy 16. So some really good valid points there. Now I can't comment on this notion about people having their first interactions with anime. I'm personally, anime is not something I dabble in too often. I really like Death Note. In fact, I love Death Note. I've got on Blu-ray over there actually, which I only bought a few weeks ago. So I think I'll give that a rewatch at some point. But back on topic, I can't comment on that side of things. But when it came to the multimedia approach, I don't think that necessarily it was intended to be filler storyline. I think they wanted it to be seen as in addition to or ancillary. But I think because the main game itself was so underdeveloped, it became almost required watching. Now, I loved the build up to Final Fantasy 15. I loved it. I was working at a cinema at the time, and the cinema ran a screening event. Now, it wasn't for Kingsglaive or anything like that. It was just showing loads of little things like the making of and things like that. And we gave people a goodie bag on the way out, like posters and stuff like that. In a cinema, I'd never seen anything like that. I was working at the time. I never actually went to the event myself. But the multimedia approach to 15 was brilliant. I really liked watching Kingsglaive and Brotherhood on the run-up to release. Now, I 100% agree with our writer here that it shouldn't, all this expanded media and stuff like that should never be required watching to understanding a show. A video game. I guess a good example would be the expanded Star Wars universe or media, if you will. And you could take this example either pre or post Disney when they erased the expanded universe timeline. But you could watch episodes 1 through 3 of Star Wars, the prequel trilogy, and you don't have to have watched Clone Wars to understand it. But if you watch Clone Wars, you have such a better understanding of that period of the Star Wars timeline. And even coming into more current day things, if you've watched Rebels, you're all primed up to watch these shows that are coming out in the future or have already came out, like The Mandalorian, Ahsoka. A lot of these seeds of characters you're seeing in that show, if you've never watched Clone Wars or Rebels, you're not lost. They're just other characters that have appeared, but you've got a deeper understanding if you've watched those anime shows beforehand. And that's the approach that I think Final Fantasy tried to do, but probably just outright failed to do. I would love for other games to take this approach in the future here. My only ask would be anything you release should be accessible on the video game console. So, Kingsglaive, you could rent that. Brotherhood, you can stream it through the YouTube app. I had never heard of this, what was it called? Prologue Parting Ways. I didn't even know that was a thing until I read this article. No wonder I was still lost in the storyline. And even to this day, I don't remember the storyline of Final Fantasy 15 that much. It was only a few years ago at this point. I don't remember much about it. I remember playing the game very well. The gameplay itself was pretty good. Obviously, the development of Final Fantasy 15 was rather tumultuous, I think is the word. It was originally Final Fantasy 13 Versus, and I went through several iterations. I think at a certain point they just had to put the game out. That's why it came out half-baked, why they haven't... well, they're not having to. I think they were going to release a DLC anyway at some point. But, you know, they went back and patched a significant portion of the end game based on fan backlash, you know, kind of similar to the Mass Effect 3 scenario of that game's ending. But I'm getting a bit off topic. What I'm saying is, I would love. So let's pick a game. Beyond Good and Evil 2, if that ever comes out. You know, if they wanted to release a film and a YouTube show that serves as either prologue or happens at the same time as that game, I'm for it. I'll consume all that. But I'm not going to go, you know, buy a book or go visit a certain website to get additional information. If it's all accessible on your Xbox or your PlayStation, then, you know, it's not too much of an ask to go and consume additional content, not mandatory content.